August 1944. The air on the island was a living thing, a thick, wet blanket woven from the threads of rot and fever. It clung to the skin, seeped into the lungs and tasted of mud and blood, and the sweet, cloying decay of unburied things. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Army garrison, this was the entire world, a suffocating green hell, a purgatory of buzzing insects and the ceaseless, dripping humidity that bred fungal blooms on their skin and in the very fabric of their uniforms. They were spectres haunting a dying world, their bodies whittled down by starvation and dysentery, their flesh a landscape of sores and leeches' kisses. Yet their spirit, their Yamato Damashi, was meant to be a fortress, an unbreachable citadel of will forged in the divine fire of the Emperor.
They were told, and they believed, that this spirit was their sharpest weapon, an ethereal katana that would ultimately sever the thick, clumsy sinews of their enemy's material strength. The Americans, they had been taught, were a mongrel race, soft and decadent, raised on milk and comfort, their minds poisoned by individualism and their bodies weak from a lack of true hardship. Their power was a hollow shell of machines and numbers, a brute force colossus with feet of clay. When faced with the pure, incandescent spirit of Japan, this colossus would inevitably crumble. Every whispered rumor from the front, every official dispatch read aloud by their hollow-eyed officers reinforced this doctrine. The enemy was clumsy, the enemy was cowardly, the enemy was wasteful and spiritually bankrupt, a civilization of merchants and hedonists playing at war. They expected to meet a foe whose cruelty was born of panic, whose violence was chaotic and undisciplined. They expected to die, of course, but to die in a way that would prove the superiority of their spirit, a final, glorious banzai charge against a terrified, unworthy opponent. This conviction was the last solid thing in a world that had dissolved into a fever dream of hunger and fear. It was the bedrock beneath the sucking mud of the jungle floor. They had seen their comrades fall not to heroic charges, but to the invisible plagues in the water and the relentless, impersonal pounding of distant artillery that chewed the landscape into a red pulp. They had gnawed on roots and boiled leather to quiet the screaming emptiness in their bellies, but through it all the central myth held firm. Their suffering was a purification, a forging of the spirit, while the enemy's comfort was a corruption, a hollowing out of their soul. The physical world might betray them, but the metaphysical truth was immutable. Spirit would conquer matter. What they found on the other side of surrender was not the expected bayonet to the gut or the panicked chaos of an inferior foe, but something far more disorienting. If you want to understand the profound psychological shifts that can occur in the crucible of war, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the human experience. The initial shock was not of violence, but of its absence. It was a cold, methodical, almost bureaucratic process. They were stripped, their rotting uniforms piled and burned, their emaciated bodies sprayed with a fine, acrid mist of delousing powder that stung their open sores. This part was familiar, a humiliation they understood. It was the clinical processing of captured animals. They stood naked and shivering, a skeletal tableau of defeat, their eyes downcast, awaiting the next degradation. And then they were marched, not to a cage or a pit, but towards a long, low building of raw timber and corrugated iron from which a strange, rhythmic hissing sound emanated, accompanied by billows of white vapor that ghosted into the humid air. The building pulsed with an alien energy, a sound of immense and constant power. Inside, the world transformed. The air was thick with steam, hot and clean, a stark contrast to the miasma of the jungle. Rows of pipes ran along the ceiling, and from them descended dozens of metal heads like metallic sunflowers, each one weeping a steady, heavy torrent of water. The floor was slanted concrete, dark and slick, with drains that swallowed the cascading water with a hungry gurgle. It was a factory for cleansing. The American guards, large men who seemed to them like giants, gestured with bored impatience at the contraption. They demonstrated, miming the act of washing, their movements efficient and devoid of any particular emotion. There was no ceremony here, no grand gesture of magnanimity or cruelty. It was simply the next step in the process. The Japanese soldiers stared, their minds struggling to categorize the scene. This was not a weapon. It was not a torture device, though the sheer alienness of it felt like a form of psychological assault. They saw the bars of soap, pale and waxy, stacked in wooden crates. They saw the sheer volume of water, a resource so precious in their jungle hell that they had hoarded it by the cupful, boiling it meticulously to stave off disease. Here it was being expended with an abandon that was not just wasteful, but obscene. It was a display of wealth so profound, so utterly beyond their lived experience, that it felt like a theatrical illusion, a carefully constructed piece of propaganda designed to awe and intimidate. A trick. It had to be a trick. Perhaps it was a chemical wash to soften their skin before interrogation, or a final decadent ritual before a mass execution. They could not yet comprehend that this was not an exception, but the rule. These moments of cultural collision reveal more about a nation's power than any battlefield victory. Join our community to explore more stories like this. The first few men who were shoved under the streams of water flinched, expecting it to be scalding or freezing, another form of torment. Instead, the water that sluiced over their filthy, emaciated bodies was hot. Not just warm, but genuinely, luxuriously hot. It was a shocking, intimate sensation, a forgotten pleasure from a life lived before the war. The heat was a physical blow, a caress so unexpected it felt like a betrayal. For years, their only contact with water had been the cold, muddy rain of the jungle or the tepid, bacteria-laden contents of their canteens. This was different. This was a force of civilization, a domesticated element brought to heel and delivered on demand in the middle of a war-torn island thousands of miles from the enemy's homeland. A wave of murmurs rippled through the prisoners. They watched the first men, their faces a mixture of terror and dawning, confused pleasure. The hot water coursed over them, washing away not just the grime and dried blood of the battlefield, but layers of their identity. The filth had been a part of them, a testament to their hardship, a physical manifestation of their spiritual struggle. To be cleansed by the enemy with the enemy's impossible technology felt like a violation. They scrubbed at their skin with the strange, fragrant soap, watching in numb disbelief as grey lather ran down their legs and into the drains, a torrent of their former selves being washed away into the earth of the island they had failed to defend. They felt a rising tide of suspicion. This had to be a singular display, a show put on for them at this initial processing center. Once they were moved to a proper camp, the reality of captivity would surely assert itself in the form of cold, brackish water and a single spigot for 1,000 men. This belief, this desperate clinging to the idea that what they were experiencing was a temporary deception, was their last line of ideological defense. The Americans were profligate, their propaganda had insisted, and this was surely the ultimate proof. To expend so much fuel to engineer such complex plumbing, simply to wash the bodies of their enemies, was not a sign of strength, but of a pathological softness, a foolish squandering of resources that a truly martial culture would never permit. They took comfort in this interpretation. It allowed them to stand under the impossibly hot water and see it not as a miracle of logistics, but as evidence of their enemy's eventual doom. They were being washed by a civilization that was drowning in its own excess. They clung to this thought as they were herded from the showers, their skin pink and tingling, and given clean, coarse cotton clothing. The world felt strange, their own bodies alien to them. The clash of ideologies is often fought not with bullets, but with everyday objects. If you find this perspective fascinating, share this video with someone who will appreciate it. The journey from that first island was a blur of dislocation. They were loaded onto ships, vast steel beasts that dwarfed anything they had ever seen. And on these ships, the impossible reality repeated itself. There were showers, not just for the officers, not just for the American crew, but designated facilities for the prisoners. The pipes hummed with the same life. The nozzles delivered the same steady, hot streams. It was no longer a spectacle, it was a routine. They were processed, fed, and washed with the same dispassionate efficiency. The food was another assault. They were given hot meals with meat and bread and coffee, things that had become distant, hazy memories. They ate until their shrunken stomachs ached, a physical pain that was both agonizing and deeply, shamefully pleasurable. With each new location, the evidence mounted, becoming an avalanche that threatened to bury their entire worldview. At a transit camp on a larger, more established base, the scale of the phenomenon became terrifyingly clear. They saw not one shower house, but rows of them. They saw vast laundries where machines the size of small huts churned and steamed, cleaning thousands of uniforms a day. They saw water purification plants, distillation units converting the endless salt water of the Pacific into an endless supply of fresh, clean water. This wasn't a trick, it wasn't propaganda, this was infrastructure. It was a system, a colossal, intricate, an utterly mundane system that treated hot water not as a luxury, but as a non-negotiable component of its military machine. The cognitive dissonance became a roaring in their ears, a constant, low-grade fever of the mind. How could a force be both decadent and so terrifyingly efficient? The two concepts were mutually exclusive in their understanding of the world. Hardship bred strength, comfort bred weakness. This was the central pillar of their faith. Yet here was a force that had institutionalized comfort, that had weaponized it, that had built a logistical network capable of projecting American-style domesticity into the heart of a combat zone. They watched young American GIs, boys with soft faces and easy laughs, complain if the coffee was cold or if the shower pressure was low. They complained about the things the Japanese soldiers had considered unattainable miracles. The Americans took it all for granted. This casual, unthinking entitlement was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. It spoke of a power that was not just military or industrial, but cultural, a deep and unshakable belief in their own right to a certain standard of living, even at war. The system that provided these amenities was invisible to the American soldiers who used them, as natural and unremarkable as the air they breathed. But for the prisoners, it was a ghost in the machine, a constant, silent testament to the enemy's true power. The real story of history is often hidden in the mundane. Click the notification bell to be alerted when we release new episodes exploring these hidden narratives. This systematic, casual abundance began to work on their minds in a way no physical abuse ever could. It was a form of psychological erosion, the steady drip of hot water on the stone of their convictions. The core of their identity as soldiers, as Japanese men, was tied to the concept of endurance, of gammon. They were men who could withstand anything, hunger, pain, filth, disease. Their ability to suffer was the source of their spiritual pride. It was what separated them from the soft, materialistic Westerner. They had been taught that the body was a temporary vessel, a tool for the spirit to wield. To neglect the body, to push it beyond its limits, was to strengthen the will. Their own military doctrine reflected this. Their supply lines were notoriously stretched, their rations meager, their medical care primitive. It was assumed that the Japanese soldier's spirit would compensate for any material lack. Now they were trapped in a world that operated on the opposite principle. The American military, it seemed, believed that the body was a machine that required careful maintenance to function at peak efficiency. A clean, well-fed, healthy soldier was a better soldier. A man who wasn't constantly battling lice, dysentery, and fungal infections had more energy to fight. A man who could look forward to a hot shower at the end of a grueling day had higher morale. It was a brutally pragmatic, materialistic philosophy, but looking around at the healthy, well-equipped giants who were their guards, and then at their own skeletal reflections, it was impossible to deny its effectiveness. The evidence was written on their own flesh. The constant comparison was a form of exquisite torture. A man standing under the hot spray would find his mind drifting back. He would remember huddling with his comrades in a muddy, waterlogged foxhole, picking lice from the seams of his tunic by candlelight. He would remember the maddening, inescapable itch of scabies, the dull, throbbing pain of trench foot, the pervasive, sour smell of unwashed bodies that was the signature scent of their army. He would remember the shame of soiling himself during a bout of dysentery, with no way to properly clean himself. These memories, once born with a kind of grim pride, were now recast in a new, humiliating light. Their suffering had not been a noble purification. It had been a symptom of their army's logistical incompetence. It was a sign not of their spiritual strength, but of their nation's material poverty. They were being defeated not just on the battlefield, but in the shower, in the mess hall, in the laundry. They were being defeated by a system that had turned basic human comfort into an overwhelming strategic advantage. The tools of war are not always what they seem. If you agree, let us know in the comments what everyday object you think has had the biggest impact on history. The psychological impact was a complex cocktail of emotions. There was, of course, a deep and gnawing humiliation. To be so thoroughly outmatched in every material aspect was a profound blow to their collective pride. Their swords were museum pieces against the enemy's machine guns. Their faith in spiritual power was a child's fantasy against the enemy's industrial might. Showers were a daily, undeniable reminder of this fact. Every time they turned the simple metal knob and were rewarded with a gush of hot water, it was another small surrender, another admission of their own side's inadequacy. It felt as though their very bodies were betraying them, reveling in the enemy's comfort, craving the very softness they had been taught to despise. Alongside the shame, a grudging, resentful awe began to grow. They were soldiers, after all, and they understood logistics, at least in theory. To project this level of infrastructure across the world's largest ocean, to build and maintain it on hostile islands, spoke of an organizational and industrial capacity that was difficult to fathom. It was one thing to read about American production numbers in a propaganda leaflet, to see them dismissed as meaningless figures. It was another thing entirely to stand dripping in a well-lit shower stall built on a coral atoll and personally experience the end result of that production. They were not just being beaten by soldiers, they were being beaten by factory workers, engineers, plumbers, and bureaucrats a world away. The war was not a contest of wills, as they had believed, but a contest of systems. And then there was the most corrosive emotion of all, envy. It was a feeling they barely dared to admit to themselves, a sentiment that felt like the ultimate treason. But it was there, in the quiet moments. The envy for the simple, thoughtless luxury of it all. The envy for a system that cared enough for its men to provide such things. They thought of their brothers and cousins still fighting, still starving in the jungles, their bodies succumbing to the same filth and disease they had just washed away. The contrast was a sharp, physical pain. The Americans were not just winning the war, they were living a better life. even in the midst of it. This realization was more devastating than any bomb, for it struck at the very heart of their cause. If the enemy's way of life was so demonstrably superior, even in its military application, then what exactly were they fighting and dying for? The battle for their minds was being waged with soap and hot water, and it was a battle they had already lost. Understanding the enemy's perspective is key to understanding history. Subscribe and join us as we continue to challenge conventional narratives. The culmination of this psychological unwinding did not happen in a single, dramatic moment, but rather in a series of quiet, devastating epiphanies. By the time many of them were transported to permanent camps in the continental United States, the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a sullen, routinized acceptance. The showers, the clean clothes, the abundant food, these were now simply part of the strange, inverted logic of their new existence. They were prisoners, stripped of their freedom and their honor, yet they were living in conditions of greater physical comfort and cleanliness than they had ever known as proud soldiers of the emperor. This paradox had become the background radiation of their lives. For one soldier, a former corporal named Sato, the symbolic shift occurred on a dusty afternoon in a camp in Texas. He watched through the wire fence as a group of American guards finished their patrol. They were young, loud, and complaining about the heat. They trudged to a barracks identical to the one Sato and his fellow prisoners were housed in. A few minutes later, he saw them again, heading towards the same shower block the prisoners used, towels slung over their shoulders. They were whistling, joking, their fatigue evident, but their spirits light. Sato watched as they stripped off their uniforms and stepped under the same nozzles, washing away the sweat and dust of their day's work. In that instant, the entire structure of his understanding collapsed. He had clung to the idea that the showers were, on some level, for them, a tool to manage them, to pacify them, perhaps even a subtle form of propaganda to impress them. He now saw the stunning, world-altering truth. The showers were not special. They were not about the prisoners at all. They were a standard feature of the American military, a baseline amenity provided to everyone, regardless of rank or role. The guards, the mechanics, the cooks, and even the prisoners, all were subject to the same system, a system that dictated a certain non-negotiable standard of hygiene and care. The hot water wasn't a privilege bestowed upon them. It was an unremarkable feature of the environment they now inhabited, as common as the dirt under their feet. It was for everyone. This was the true nature of the enemy's power. It wasn't the tanks or the planes. It was the deeply ingrained, culturally encoded belief that even the lowest-ranking soldier deserved a hot shower. If this story has changed the way you think about power and conflict, share it with your friends and start a conversation. This realization was the final, fatal blow to the myth of spiritual superiority. The Japanese military system was built on a rigid, almost feudal hierarchy. A general and a private were practically different species. The idea that they would use the same facilities, enjoy the same basic comforts, was unthinkable. Such a thing would erode the very discipline and reverence for authority upon which the entire structure rested. Their system was designed to elevate the spirit by punishing the flesh, and the punishment was applied most severely at the bottom. The American system, by contrast, seemed almost democratic in its application of basic amenities. It valued the individual soldier's body, his morale, his physical well-being, not out of any particular kindness, but out of a cold, calculated pragmatism. It had built a machine for winning wars, and it had correctly identified the individual soldier as the machine's most crucial component, one that needed to be kept clean, fueled, and in good working order. Sato finally understood. The shower was no longer just a jet of hot water. It was a symbol, a liquid manifestation of an entire worldview. It represented a society that could afford to care, about the small comforts of its individual members, even in the midst of a global cataclysm. It represented an industrial base so vast, so powerful, that it could mass-produce not only weapons of unimaginable destruction, but also comfort and cleanliness on an epic scale. It represented a fundamental difference in the valuation of human life. His own culture had taught him that the individual was nothing, that the collective was everything, that his life was a pebble to be thrown at the enemy, his death a small but noble contribution to the emperor's glory. The Americans, it seemed, had built a system on the opposite premise, that the collective was strong because the individual was strong, or at least well-maintained. They had not abandoned materialism for the sake of spirit. They had harnessed materialism in service of a different kind of spirit, the spirit of overwhelming, inexorable, systematic victory. The war, Sato realized with a clarity that felt like a physical sickness, had been a contest between a nation that believed in the power of the soul to overcome the deficiencies of the body and a nation that believed in the power of hot water to sustain the body so the soul could keep fighting. He finally knew who had been right. The water that had washed the dirt from his skin had also washed the lies from his mind, leaving him clean, empty, and defeated in a way he had never imagined possible. History is filled with these small, symbolic moments that carry immense weight. To make sure you don't miss our next exploration, click subscribe now. The end of the war was an abstraction, a radio announcement that crackled in a language they barely understood. The real end had already occurred for these men, in quiet, personal moments of surrender in mess halls and shower blocks across America. The return home was the final, cruel inversion of their experience. They left a country of impossible abundance, a place where even prisoners of war were treated with a level of material care they had never known, and returned to a homeland that was a landscape of ashes and ghosts. They stepped from the ships into a world of ruins, of starvation, of a people shattered and lost. The scarcity they had once embraced as a source of spiritual strength was now the grim, inescapable reality of their defeated nation. The hunger was no longer a temporary trial of the soldier, but the permanent condition of the citizen. The filth and disease were not confined to the jungle front, but rampant in the bombed-out cities. They were home, but home was now the hell they had thought they had left behind. The irony was a poison in their blood. In America, as prisoners, they had been clean and well-fed. In Japan, as free men, they were starving and ragged, surrounded by a level of privation that made their POW camps seem like a distant, dreamlike paradise. This experience created a chasm between them and the rest of their countrymen. How could they explain it? How could they tell their families, who had been subsisting on watery soup and radishes, that they had been given 3 hot meals a day? How could they describe to their wives, who were hauling water from a communal well, the memory of standing under an endless stream of hot water? To speak of such things would sound like a boast, or worse, a form of treason. It would be a profound insult to the suffering of their own people. It was a truth that was both undeniable and incommunicable. And so they remained silent. The memory of the showers became a secret, a private emblem of their true, comprehensive defeat. Their bodies had been repatriated, but their minds were forever haunted by the ghost of a world whose power was so absolute it could afford to be comfortable. These personal stories of war are often lost to the grand narratives. Help us keep them alive by liking this video and sharing your thoughts below. The long-term legacy of this cultural and psychological shock was profound. For the generation of Japanese men who experienced it, the world was irrevocably split into a before and an after. Before, they had been adherents to an ideology of spiritual supremacy and glorious, sacrificial death. After, they were the unwilling witnesses to a different kind of power, one rooted in logistics, industry, and a shockingly pragmatic humanism. This was not a conversion born of lectures or re-education programs, which were often clumsy and met with cynical resistance. It was a conversion born of soap, of clean cotton, of hot coffee, and above all, of the ceaseless, miraculous flow of hot water. These men, the survivors, returned to Japan and became part of the force that rebuilt it. Their motivations were complex, but for many, the memory of that casual American abundance became a silent, driving force. They had seen what a modern industrial nation could achieve. They had experienced in the most intimate and personal way the consequences of falling behind. The Japan they would go on to build would be a testament to the lessons learned not on the battlefield, but in the POW camp. It would be a nation obsessed with efficiency, with quality, with logistics, with creating the very kind of material and technological power that had so comprehensively defeated them. In their old age, many of these men would still find it difficult to speak of their time as prisoners. The shame of surrender was still a potent cultural force, but in the quiet moments, the sensory memory would return, the sting of the delousing powder, the coarse feel of the clean uniform, and the enveloping, impossible warmth of the hot water. It was a memory that held no glory, no honor in the traditional sense, but it held a truth more powerful than any battle flag. It was the memory of the moment they understood that their entire world, their system of beliefs, their very understanding of strength and weakness had been washed away, leaving them standing naked and shivering, not from the cold, but from the dawning, terrifying light of a new reality. Their war had not ended with the Emperor's broadcast, but with the turn of a simple metal faucet. The ultimate weapon of the 20th century was not the atomic bomb, which destroyed cities, but the industrial system that could deliver a hot shower to the middle of nowhere, which destroyed ideologies. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the complexities of human history. Your viewership supports our mission to tell the stories that matter. We'll see you in the next one.